Okay, so picking up on where we left off last week, we intentionally did not cover the four other views discussed in the book that you mentioned. If I forget the exact title, The Four Views of Hell.
The four views of hell.
Uh,
Yes.
and so it is your intention that these next few weeks we go over each of these views specifically, um, talking about their um, specific specifics and details therein. Um, so the first one on the list is eternal conscious torment, and so I'll start with our first question of what is this view?
So ETC is also more. It's probably more commonly just referred to as the traditionalist view, and it is the view that majority of Christians, more that would affirm hell, today are going to have the more most throughout history are going to have this view. It has a lot of um, I guess, popular backing in that sense. That is why it is referred to as the traditionalist view. Um, and so the three main points are that it is eternal, it is conscious, and it is torment. Um, Usually, you don't get much argument on the torment side of things, other than the fact of, is that just the justice question, which we talked about last week, which we will spend a lot of time with. Um, but then the other two are kind of the biggest points, that it is eternal and that it is conscious. Um, and so this view, and there's a lot of different. Um, I guess I would refer to it as applications of this view, right? So you can have a lot of separation in this wide camp about, you know, is hell an actual place? Is hell is the devil running around torturing people? Which no, it is, like what's actually happening there? How that all functions? Um, but usually it it's centered around those points. Um, and so it's the view that, like, it lasts the whole time. It is infinite in duration. You're fully conscious. Most people have this. You're fully conscious the whole time because they don't have this idea like that we're dealing with the asymptotic view. Um, and it's painful and it's terrible and it's awful. Um, yeah, I would think that of the views that we'll be discussing, it's probably the one that people are going to be most familiar with. So yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly the one prior to you pioneering your view, sharing that with me. It's the one that I was most familiar with.
Yeah,
Um,
and before I was gonna say that, before I developed my view, I definitely was in the eternal conscious torment camp. Um, and if we get into it a little bit later, really, you could conceive of my argument as still being an eternal conscious torment view. Because if you take each of those words individually, the asymptotic view still affirms each of those each of those points. It just understands some of them slightly differently. So
so in the kind of Peterson notion of like if a simple idea lasts a really long time, there's something to that idea. There's a certain strength to that idea. What are the actual strengths of this view for it to
so
have stuck around so long?
so easily, I think the best strength of the eternal conscious torment view is the fact that, um, if you do just a basic, like, reading of the scriptures, something like the eternal conscious torment view is more often than not what you are going to come away with. And so like if you read this book, um, the guy that talks about that, the way that this book works is that each section for each of you, a different author is writing it and defending it, right? And so Denny Burke is defending Eternal Conscious Torment. Um, this here, I'll you know, I can do a quick little um. This is his whole like section, right? This is how thick it is. Uh, all of this, so like 90% of his like text that he in the space that he uses to defend Eternal Conscious Torment is all analysis of biblical texts. Um, he by far more than any other author defending their view, he is constantly like here's the biblical uh sources. And um really though, I'll point this out. So this is from the text, and from his defense, and he goes, as we focus on each of them, each of the verses, we find that the final state of the dam has at least three characteristics: final separation, unending experience, and just retribution. And he'll go through all of these different, so he has 10 foundational texts, but obviously you could use more than that. But he uses those 10 foundational texts to argue for those 3 points: that it is, in fact, a final separation, that it is in fact an unending experience, and that it is a just retribution. Um, and so that's one of the things that is the strongest for it. Um, I also think that a strong a notion for eternal conscious torment, which honestly in this debate I think is uh, often overlooked, and often not discussed. I just killed a fly with my hellbook. Um, there's some symbolism happens for you right there. Uh, um, uh, um, one of the points that I think often gets overlooked in these hell debates, if you watch a hell debate online, uh, is the idea that hell should be bad. Like you should really think of hell as being a bad place, as a place that you don't want to go to, as a place that you know you wouldn't be okay with in some sense. Um, and as we get to the other views, we'll see that I think that is a problem that the other views actually have. That in many ways they're making hell not as bad. Now, you could make that critique also um, of my view, I think, but I think my view does it in a more measured and meaningful way. Um, but yeah, and that will last with people because um, we the modern world, modern society balks against hell because we live in a comfortable society, and so we don't like the idea of people being punished. Um, and because we are a society that has, um, in a myriad of ways, attempted to divorce ourselves from the reality of evil. Um, and I don't think that this was as much of an issue for most of human history because most humans for most of human history have had a much closer relationship with evil, and particular human evil, and so they were much more willing to affirm, oh yeah, this is why hell exists. this is why we affirm hell. Um, so yeah, I think that is those sort of two things are why the traditionalist view has a lot of weight.
It certainly has that going for it. The idea that there ought to be a punishment, right? And punishment this view has like it nails it um, on that idea. That said, what are some of the weaknesses of this view?
Yeah. So the weaknesses are going to be related to the question that I talked about last week about um, how do you account for the model of hell being just? So now, I just uh, highlighted that he has all these foundational verses where it's arguing that hell is just, and yes, the Bible does that. The Bible affirms that hell is a just punishment. I agree. What it doesn't do is it doesn't explain how that justice actually like philosophically functions, how it philosophically is justified. It doesn't the Bible doesn't really take any time to do that. It just says these are bad people, they deserve to be punished. This is like what the punishment is kind of like. And I don't think we should really be surprised about that because there's lots of philosophical arguments that the Bible doesn't make or do or spend any time on. Um, the most obvious one being the existence of God. Like the Bible doesn't spend any time being like, oh, here are reasons for why you should believe that God exists. It just doesn't take time with that. It just says, yeah, he does, and go on, and we're gonna do a bunch of stuff. Um, and the Bible does that kind of all the time with a bunch of different things. And that's one of the things that's going on here. Now, very clearly, um, you know, uh, Mr. Burke, Professor Burke, I don't know what his job or criteria is. I don't know if he's a doctor. I really don't know. But uh, he also, and as we'll see as we go throughout like this series and talk about it, everybody in some way does feel the need to answer this question. And it by far is actually the weakest part of his argument. And I could actually give examples from other popular apologists that I like. So we could do that in a little bit. William Lane Craig, uh, whenever they talk about this issue, their solutions, everybody seems to um, see the need to make some kind of argument for how exactly eternal conscious torment is just. And so I'm going to read just a little snippet of where he's trying to make an argument. And I'm going to try and summarize it a little bit. But he has this idea of that you're walking along and you see a man pulling the legs off of a grasshopper, and uh, you like you have a sense of like that's somewhat wrong. Like you probably like shouldn't be doing that. But then you do it again, and now he's pulling the legs off of a frog, and he's like, that might be like that. It's probably a little bit worse than like a grasshopper. And then he's like, oh, but then what if it's the legs of a bird? And then he amplifies it up and he goes, what about the legs of a puppy? And then finally he goes, what about if it's the legs of a baby, of a human baby? And if it's a human baby, well, like that's too far. Now, actually, you're not just gonna like let this man get away with pulling the legs off of this creature. You're gonna step in, right? And so what he argues is he goes, um, sin, um, the difference between these scenarios isn't the sin that's committed. It's the difference is the one who is sinned against, right? And so he says, you react differently because the seriousness of the sin is not measured merely by the sin itself, but by the value and the worth of the one being sinned against. The more noble and valuable the creature, the more heinous and reprehensible it is to assault the creature. And there is a world of difference between a grasshopper and a baby. Um, uh, the seriousness of sin and thus of the punishment due to sin is not measured merely by the sin itself, but by the value uh, and the worth of the one sinned against. Right. So he establishes this principle. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and I want to keep going through his argument a little bit, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that principle of that the value and the work like the severity of the sin is determined somewhat by the value and the worth of the one being sinned against, that is not true. And in fact, it's just not a biblical argument. And not only is it not so not only is it not a biblical argument in the sense that it just doesn't show up in the Bible, but actually it's kind of an anti-biblical argument, because the Bible actually argues the opposite, that it actually doesn't matter the value of the being that you sin against. That it actually so it actually argues a couple things. One, the worth of the being that you sin against um, doesn't change based off of like these characteristics, based off of the nobleness of it, and two, that actually all sins are against God, right? So like this kind of this kind of doesn't matter, right? Um, it doesn't matter the worth of the one that you're sinning against because ultimately all are against God. And this is usually combined with this idea of um, uh, to sin against an infinitely glorious being is therefore an infinitely heinous offense that is worthy of an infinitely heinous punishment, right? And something along those lines is usually the argument that is given. Um, so all so let's go back and discuss this a little bit more. There's a reason why he stops at so there's so I'll give him this amount of credit. There is a little bit of truth to what he's saying, that yes, the value of the being that you are committing the sinful act against does matter to some degree. Um, but what actually matters more is something like uh, the relative difference between uh, the two beings, right? Because notice that he stops in his example at a human baby, and his direct linear path, right? What he's trying to do is he's trying to make a linear path of like, as the ontological value of the being goes up, the severity of the punishment of the sin due should go up. Therefore, once you get up to God, it's an infinitely punishable sin, right? The problem is that if you actually track that along, um, if you go from human baby to human being, like just regular person, right? Well, suddenly, actually, many people would argue that the punishment for pulling the legs off of a baby should probably be more than pulling the legs off of just, like a person, right? And then it becomes weird, because then we start evaluating, like, okay, wait, why are you doing this? Like, is there some kind of like punishment involved? Like, is there some kind of moral, right? You start evaluating the moral character of the person, and you start evaluating the authority of the one um doing the act, right? Whatever that sinful like act is, right? And so there's just
Well, I suppose you could, for that specific example, you could have some kind of strange ontological basis of saying that babies actually hold a higher protected class than adult people. But then you could still do the same move of say, okay, say it's a prince, as a baby, and actually the punishment is an equal punishment.
And
It's not a
this is
more severe.
where actually this where it gets into where I was trying to say earlier about that the Bible actually goes against it, is that the Bible is actually trying to get people to kind of not think along those terms, right? Because the way that most other ancient like law codes work is, oh, if you're a king, if you're a prince, if you're part of the aristocracy, if you're part of whatever, and someone sinned against you, well, that's actually a bigger issue, right? And whereas if you sinned against a slave, well, then it's okay. And the Bible actually, from very early on, is arguing against this point, against this idea. And in fact, I again, if I was good at what I'm trying to do here, I would have already opened it up. But like so, Lamech's what is it? Lamech's speech in Genesis, right? Right. So what does Lamech say? Da, 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 right. Um, Hearken unto speech. Yeah. If Cain be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Right. What Lamech is doing is he is arguing that sins against him should be punished more severely than sins against Cain. And the Bible is going out of its way to say no, this isn't good. That this is actually that establishing this principle and 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 stating that this is how punishment should be enacted is actually a way of perpetuating and amplifying sin, right? Because go back and listen to our Genesis stuff. This is a part of the thing that amplifies violence in the world and what eventually leads to the flood and all of this stuff. The Bible is arguing against this principle. The Bible is not affirming this principle. Um, and so, rather, what I would say is that um, the Bible affirms what I would say instead is that the Bible is affirming that, um, you know, when a punishment occurs or when a sin occurs, all sins are ultimately towards God, but that they still have a finite punishment associated with them, right? All of those sins that are talked about in the Levitical law, right? They're all thought of as being against God, but they have a finite punishment associated with them. This idea of of infinite punishment um, is due to the infinite nature of God is just it is just something that is foreign to the Bible. It is not in there. And the thing is like, if it was in there, then the guy that quoted the Bible more than anybody else in this text would have provided a verse that showcased that. And he didn't, because that verse does not exist, right? There what the verses show is those other points that I talked about earlier about final separation, unending experience, and that it is just. It does not provide this framework, this philosophical argument for, oh, the sin is against an infinite God, therefore an infinite punishment. That argument never shows up in Scripture, and that is Eternal Conscious Torment's um, main weakness.
Um, is there anything else you want to cover on that topic before we get into how it compares to your view?
No, no, not really.
Okay, then let's jump into that. So, where's some of the main jumping off points of differentiation between uh, this, fairly um, self-explanatory view
Yeah.
and your.
So I'll start off by saying that there are a lot of similarities, right? And I've already mentioned this, but you know, my view, the asymptotic view, uh, it it is going to affirm a lot of the same things that eternal conscious torment does, right? It's eternal in time. You the subject that is in hell is conscious the entire time, right? The difference being that um, in traditional eternal conscious torment um, framework, that is 100% conscious the whole time. Um, uh, Mine is not 100% conscious the whole time. Mine is a waning consciousness. So that's that's a difference. Um, and then it is torment the whole time, right? And I agree that it is torment the whole time. The 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 nature of that torment could be, hotly debated, and um, this is sort of one of those things where there's a lot of times in um, philosophical discussion or philosophical and theological discussions and debates that um, a lot of times like um, what you can do is you can take a view and it can be a modifier to like another view, and in a lot of ways my view is that um, and in fact like of all the views that we are going to compare it with, right? um, there are like eternal conscious torment, the conditional view, uh, universalist view, and then finally is C.S. Lewis's view, which we may or may not do. Uh, and kind of all of those views, you could also you could augment those views just by applying my asymptotic view understanding of consciousness to all of those views. You sort of have that freedom, but my view would be closest to take the traditionalist view, apply the asymptotic um, understanding of consciousness to it. Um, uh, and so yeah, those are the main um, main differences. Is just that understanding of how consciousness works um, and gets applied to it. And I think um, so. I think so to me, like some of the verses that are actually the most um, helpful to this can uh, so let's yeah. So here in Revelation, and he will be tormented with fire and suffer in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. So I think that that line of they will have no rest day or night, to me, that's pretty much we'll talk about this more next week. To me, that's almost an immediate defeater of um, the conditionalist view, right? And so you have to have consciousness being eternal, or yeah, you have to have the subject um, being conscious the entire time, to some degree, because that is like the definition of what no rest is, right? Get it when you're
Right.
getting rest, you're 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 not um, you're not fully conscious, right?
And the way you would interpret that for your view is that you would look at rest as like the state of like zero on that line, which is why a state of rest is never actually achieved.
Which I
Um,
think is a very reasonable understanding, because that's sort of how people in modern parlance use that understanding, right? Like
mm.
right this is the sleep when you're dead kind of a thing, right? Like we associate like no activity. We associate no activity with with like non-existence, right? Because most people like that are going to affirm like a no afterlife, like atheists, right? They're gonna be like, oh yeah, like they're finally at rest because they they're there's nothing going on, right? I think that's the way that most people identify those those kind of things, right? Um,
Mhm.
so yeah.
And to
Anyways,
piggyback off of a point I made last week, it's going to be a trend with all these, except maybe the C.S. Lewis view, is that none of these views are looking at this in the form of like, other than some of the more loose descriptions given in scripture of like, this is exactly what hell looks like, and this is the layout of hell, and this is Dante's seven rings or seven levels or whatever. None of these claims are addressing that. And in another way, which is why it's so easy to look at how similar these two views that we're talking about today specifically are, is because it's the one tweak on it, a little more fine tuning into it, um, is all that's really being asserted. So
yeah, yep.
okay, with that, if you have anything else, you can say that, or I don't think I have too many extra questions tonight. We can open it up. Katie, I see you're here. If you got anything you want to ask. Um,
I will still need to like ponder it all a bit more to formulate more questions. The main thing I think that I know I got here late, so it probably will make more sense once I go back and the whole video. Um, I think I'm still trying to kind of understand the differences between the two views. So from what I understand, I think you're saying how is that it's it's technically eternal torment, but it's not eternal torment because eternal torment is required, and also how the suffering is like sinned throughout that, whereas the other view is based upon the principle that eternal torment or infinite torment is required because you sinned against an infinite being. And point against that being that that point isn't specifically found in scripture, that it has to be infinite.
So your question kind of got jumbled up, and I didn't fully understand what you were asking. But you did remind me that I didn't talk about um, William Lane Craig's view. Um, so William Lane Craig's view is that the reason why um, the torment in hell is infinite is because when you are in hell, um, you are continuously committing more sin. And so, because you are continuously committing more sin, um, that is what leads to the sin being infinite. So you are so William Lane Craig, I think smartly, is not making the whole argument of, oh, you're sinning against an infinite God, therefore the punishment is infinite. He doesn't argue for that. Instead, he comes up with a different line of reasoning. And this is one of those things where maybe other people do have a different line of reasoning that works better for this, and I'm open to hearing it. But I've researched this for a long while, and I haven't really heard a better line of argumentation. But William Lane Craig's line of argumentation is this he, is that the reason why it's infinite is because you are infinitely sinning, and there's a couple of issues that I have with that. One is we don't have a whole lot of it's sort of an argument from silence because we don't really have anything to suggest that people can sin in the afterlife. Um, I suppose the strongest argument that you could make for that is something along the lines of, well, um, at some point in time, angels sinned, and therefore it is possible to sin, in the spiritual realm, and so therefore sin could continuously be applied. The problem then is because hell is supposed to be the punishment for the final judgment, and in order for like that argumentation of, well, they're continuously sinning, therefore they're continuously being punished, you you'd have to also have continuous judgment, and we don't have any indication of you have continuous judgment going on. It's like, no, there's one judgment, and then that's it, right? And so that doesn't really work. It also has another issue that I think is a bad uh, kind of implement. Man, I don't know how to talk. Uh, a bad side effect. I don't know why I can't say that word right now. It has a bad side effect to it that if the reason why they are infinitely being punished for sin is because they are continuously sinning, it kind of brings about the idea that, well, what if they just stop sinning? And so if they manage to somehow stop sinning while in hell, it leads to the conclusion that, well, then maybe they can get out of hell, right? And now you're into the realm of this idea uh, of like post final judgment redemption path, which we'll end up talking about more when we get to universalism and actually with C.S. Lewis's view. Um, but, and I don't want to get into it super um, a bunch here, but regardless, um, I do not agree with a post final judgment opportunity for redemption. I think that there's very little biblical evidence that that is a thing. Um, and so those are sort of my two problems with William Lane Craig's answer for how to justify uh, the justice issue in hell. Did that help at all, Katie?
Yes, it did. I'm in the car, so that might be why there's some extra noise. But no, that did help.
Okay. If you wanted to reword it, I'd be all right with you trying to take another stab at it.
Okay. I was more just originally asking kind of for clarification, which again probably will be clarified when I just listen to the video. But I heard you say that the view that you were comparing yours with, I remember what it's called. It starts with a C. But the other view, it believes that because we sinned against an infinite God, the punishment has to be infinite. And how your
That's
view.
eternal conscious torment. Yep, that's the one we're talking about.
Okay. So, but your view, even though you're not prescribing to that, you're still saying that it is, to an extent, eternal torment. So I guess I was just trying to clarify the difference. And I think the difference you were saying was that in your view, you don't feel like it has to be eternal for the sake of God being like infinite or
Yep.
eternal.
So I'll explain that. So for I'll try to clarify this. So um, I don't agree with the principle, right? So um, one of the ways that people that try to justify eternal conscious torment is they'll say that there's a principle at work, and that principle is if you sin against an infinite God, therefore the punishment should be infinite. That principle I don't agree with at all. It's not in the Bible, and 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 it and uh, actually the Bible argues against it. And so if I would actually describe it as anti-Bible, right? It's not just non-biblical, it's anti-biblical. It goes against that principle goes against what the Bible teaches. However, I do affirm that hell is eternal torment because the Bible says that it is eternal torment. It is eternal in time, right? And so if you go back and you watch, what I whenever I described my view, right? So my view is eternal in time, but it is finite in the amount of suffering that the person experiences, right? And I explain via the math how that works. Whereas eternal conscious torment is eternal in time, so we're both eternal in time, but they have an infinite amount of suffering that the person experiences. My view does not have an infinite amount of suffering that the person experiences. My view has a finite amount of suffering that the person experiences. And so that is a key distinction, which I should have brought up whenever everyone was asking for key distinctions. But that is like a key distinction between my view and eternal conscious torment. I do not affirm that there's an infinite amount of punishment in hell. It is infinite in time. It takes place over an infinite amount of time. But the amount of suffering that the person experiences is a finite amount, and it is a just amount according to the finite amount of sins that they committed prior to being in hell. Because I don't think you can commit sins in hell. I don't think that's a thing.
Yeah, no, that makes more sense. And I remember seeing the diagram in the other video, and how the space under the curved line, like it was connected on both sides, so that space was like finite.
Yes.
So I guess my follow-up question, which I might just be forgetting if you mentioned this in the other video, but if it's a finite amount of suffering, my brain immediately goes, then eventually they won't suffer. But I think what you're saying is that technically, because it's an infinite amount of time, they still would keep suffering, but it's just like this mathematical thing where it is still technically a finite amount of.
Yes. So at any point,
Okay.
in time, so there will never be a point in time where they stop suffering. That will never happen, right? At every point in time, it doesn't matter where you stop it, they will be suffering. All that will change is the amount that they are suffering. The amount that they are suffering will go down. That's it. That's the change. So if you were
Like the beer story.
yes, exactly. The amount
Okay.
it doesn't matter which mathematician you go to in that joke. They're all getting beer. They're all getting some amount of beer, right? But as you go to the end of, imagine they're all lined up. Imagine all the mathematicians are lined up. The further down the line that you go, every single one of them has some amount of beer. But the further that you go, the amount of beer that they're getting is all getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, this doesn't actually work in like real life because like atoms and like you start getting down to like the size of atoms, right? And you can't split them anymore and all that stuff. This is a whole other argument about whether or not actual infinites exist and everything. And they don't in our present reality. In our present reality, there are no actual infinites. But we're talking about existence where there is actual infinites. That's what we believe heaven is. Heaven and hell are, that there are actual infinites. And so you get to apply rules for actual infinites. And one of those, I think, could be this asymptotic reduction of uh, of consciousness. So yeah.
That makes a lot more sense.
Anything else,
Okay.
Kevin?
Yeah. So
this is more just a thing, just straight up with your view, and it's something I've been mulling over for the past week since we last talked about it, which is that so how, and this is a perspective thing, right? This is going to be a perspective based critique, which is because in your view the suffering is eternally diminishing. The way you could phrase that is that it's eternally getting better
Hell's
for
always
them,
getting better. Yep.
which is a problem because it's also your stance on heaven.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's a perspective problem there. Of course, you could flip it and say it's an eternal diminishing, which would also be that would be a better mirroring of heaven, which would work. But along with the idea of it's always getting better, you have the same problem of that first minute in heaven is like infinitely bad, but like it's not that bad after that. So what do you do with all that? What are your thoughts on that? Because you've
So
messed with this longer than I have.
I have thought about it, right? And I actually was going to say that. I was like, someone could make the critique of like that is a plausible critique. But the thing is like it's not a critique that I'm really worried about, because like it's one of those things where it's not actually a biblical critique, right? If that's the critique that you're making of my view, you're in the realm of like, is this a philosophical principle that applies? Like where is the philosophical principle of hell should always be getting worse, or hell should always stay the same amount of worse? Hell can't get better. You, you'd have to make a you have to make a in my opinion you'd have to make a biblical argument for that, right? And I think that you can fairly apply those critiques to some of the other views that we're going to talk about, but I think that's because they're actually um I think those other views kind of they step over the line, right? They step over
Right, that's the
my
spoiler about the next
yeah
week. So they undo it. They undo.
yeah they basically undo hell in many respects. Well, but also I'm kind of making a pun of like the asymptotic view doesn't cross the line, right? Whereas their views like
Yeah.
they cross the line, right? And I think that's kind of where that balance is that like so I'm willing to just bite the bullet and say, yeah, in my view, hell is eternally getting better, but it's you still don't want to do it because there's no there's no there's no post final judgment redemption. Like the people that are in hell are gonna be in hell forever, and it's gonna be a bad experience. You don't want to be there, but it is always going to get better. And if anything, I actually think that this sort of helps with one of those other questions that sort of comes up when people have these thoughts about the afterlife and being in heaven, because one of the common like atheist critiques is like, well, why would I want to be in heaven if my loved ones are eternally suffering in hell? And I kind of think that actually um, so there's multiple actually there's sort of multiple scriptures that kind of talk about this point, and sort of the most famous one I think is actually the parable of that Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus, and right, and the rich man, he says, um, like, go and tell all of my relatives that they don't want to come here because it's so bad, right? And which again is the main argument of that of that parable is hell is bad. You should affirm that hell is bad that you don't want to go there. But I think if my view is right, which that parable in of itself isn't really talking about, um, I think it is a comfort to the people that are going to be in heaven that actually, your loved one that didn't make it, they're never coming, but their suffering is diminishing, and their suffering is always diminishing. And it is it's kind of like an eternal goodbye. It's an eternal like they're being cast into the outer darkness. They're like a wandering star in the gloom. Like it's it's not happy. It's not good. Um, but it is sober and it is true. And I think it is. I think I ultimately, so one of my core presuppositions, right, is that whatever heaven and hell are, um, once God is done talking to us about them, I think we will all affirm that they are fair and just. I think
Yeah.
we'll end up seeing. I think we'll end up seeing and recognizing the Lord's justice.
As we're talking about the other thing that comes up is like the Vanderklay, and I don't remember if this is a Vervaekean idea either, but like the reciprocal broadening and reciprocal narrowing idea of a continuous spiral up versus a continual like spiraling down. And I guess if that is your view of heaven versus hell, that it does map on to that. And I suppose, yeah, better probably wouldn't be the correct term. Perhaps easier is, because there's nothing at the end of it,
Yes.
that you're directing towards, it, other than like these are common like business terms of like, positive reinforcement versus, negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is just the removal of negative
Yes.
things
Yes.
in the situation. Like
Yes.
you do something, like in the business world, the idea is like, okay, you intentionally set up bad conditions, and then whenever they do something good, you actually start to remove the bad conditions.
Yes.
um Now there's no do something good, but it's a thing being done to them that the conditions are kind of being removed from them. So there are different directions. There's enough ways to get around it. I was just saying, for the sake of like the instinctual thing of like, that makes it similar to heaven in a way, but I think there's a way in which you can argue it's opposite. So I think it's fine.
Well, and again, it's also not a thing that I'm. You can make it. There are verses where you can make the argument, and actually, I just read it, that hell is supposed to kind of be a part of heaven, right? That's the part about, and they will be tormented with fire and the sulfur, and that the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest. The smoke of their torment, right? And there's a lot like the smoke of their torment, like it's supposed to be going up to God in some ways, and it's like, okay, what does that mean? And like that kind of means that like if heaven is centered around God, like hell is sort of at the center of, in some ways, hell is at the center of heaven, and like, okay, well, how do you? But it's also going up and out in a way, and like, and this is one of those things of where seemingly contradictory terms are trying to be used to describe a complex idea, right? Um, and and you'll end up having that. You have that in C.S. Lewis's vision as well. Um, and so I'm not. So yes, you're right. I could rephrase it in a different way so that it still works, but I'm not really worried about needing to rephrase it in a way, because I actually don't think. I think you could try to word it in a way that makes my view sound bad, and I actually think it doesn't hurt it. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's everything that we needed to cover
Yep.
for this week.
Thank you both for being here.
Hmm.